Tonight, we're diving into the strange, uncomfortable, and sometimes terrifying rules of medieval marriage, a world where love was often the least important part of getting married. But before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it where you are right now? I always love seeing people from all around the world relaxing together in the comments before sleep. And hey, if you enjoy relaxing history stories that help you unwind, fall asleep, or just escape reality for a little while, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps more than you think, especially while this little channel is still growing. Every like, comment, and subscription tells YouTube that people enjoy these cozy history videos, and it helps me continue making more for you. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe put on some rain sounds, and let's travel back to medieval Europe together. Now then, let's begin. If you could travel back to medieval Europe and ask an ordinary couple whether they married for love, there's a very good chance they would stare at you in complete confusion. Love, at least the kind we imagine today. Romance, emotional connection. Marrying your soulmate was often considered unreliable, impractical, and sometimes even dangerous. Marriage was not primarily about happiness. It was about survival, property, alliances, religion, inheritance, labor, and control. In fact, for many people, especially women, marriage was less like a romantic milestone and more like entering a lifelong contract that was almost impossible to escape. And tonight, as rain taps softly outside and the candles flicker in our imaginary medieval village, we're going to step into that world together. A world where weddings could be arranged before children were even old enough to speak properly, where the church watched people's private lives obsessively, and where saying "I do" could completely determine the rest of your existence. Now, of course, medieval Europe lasted for roughly 1,000 years, and life varied wildly depending on whether you were rich, poor, noble, peasant, English, French, German, Italian, or somewhere else entirely. But one thing stayed surprisingly consistent. Marriage was rarely just between two people. Families were involved, villages were involved, landowners were involved, and above all else, the church was involved. Medieval society believed marriage affected social order itself. A bad marriage could create disputes over land, inheritance, legitimacy, and power. So people's relationships became everybody's business. Imagine your neighbors, priest, relatives, and local authorities all feeling personally invested in who you married, whether you consummated the marriage properly, whether you produced children quickly enough, and whether you behaved appropriately as husband and wife. Privacy, as we understand it today, barely existed. For noble families, marriage was often closer to political strategy than romance. A daughter might be married off to secure peace between rival families. A son could be forced into marriage to gain land, money, or military alliances. Some noble girls were promised to future husbands while still toddlers. And yes, that means in some cases, wedding arrangements happened before the children even fully understood what marriage was. Medieval parents weren't necessarily being cruel by the standards of their time. They genuinely believed securing a good marriage meant securing survival and protection. Love could come later, hopefully, but sometimes it never came at all. There are heartbreaking letters from later medieval periods hinting at lonely wives trapped in cold relationships with men they barely knew, yet society expected them to endure quietly and obedient. And if you were poor, well, strangely enough, peasants sometimes had slightly more freedom in choosing partners than nobles did. But that freedom came with brutal economic reality. Marriage required resources. You needed food, shelter, tools, maybe livestock. In some regions, peasants literally needed permission from their lord to marry. Yes, permission, especially if marrying meant moving away from land owned by the lord. Some landlords charged special marriage taxes or fees. Imagine having to pay your local rulers simply for the right to fall in love. Romantic isn't it? Medieval lords were deeply concerned about labor. Peasant marriages affected who worked the fields, who inherited farming duties, and how stable the village economy remained. So, even among ordinary people, marriage was never entirely private. One of the strangest parts of medieval marriage is how young people could be considered legally old enough to marry. Under church law, girls could technically marry at 12 years old, and boys at 14. Now, to be clear, not everyone married that young. In reality, many peasants married later, often in their late teens or 20s, because survival required financial stability first. But among nobles, especially for political alliances, child marriages absolutely happened. Sometimes, the couple wouldn't live together immediately, but the marriage agreement itself was legally binding. And honestly, imagining 12-year-olds navigating medieval marriage expectations feels deeply unsettling today. Yet in medieval society, childhood itself was viewed very differently. Life expectancy was shorter. Death was common. Disease was everywhere. People entered adult responsibilities frighteningly early. And speaking of unsettling things, let's talk about consent, because this part surprises many people. Officially, the medieval church actually insisted mutual consent mattered in marriage. In theory, a marriage required both individuals to agree. That sounds surprisingly progressive for the Middle Ages, doesn't it? But reality was far messier. Family pressure could be overwhelming. Social expectations were crushing. Refusing a marriage chosen by your family could create scandal, financial disaster, or even danger, especially for women. Consent often existed in a deeply unequal environment. A noble daughter, pressured by powerful parents and church authorities, may technically have said yes. But how free was that choice, really? And then there was the bizarre medieval obsession with consummation. A marriage was considered fully complete only after sexual intercourse occurred. If consummation never happened, there could actually be grounds for annulment. This led to some deeply awkward and invasive situations. In certain cases, witnesses might even become involved in proving whether consummation occurred. There are records of medieval courts discussing incredibly private bedroom details in shocking depth. Imagine entire legal arguments centered around whether a husband was physically capable of consummating the marriage. Some cases involved witnesses testifying about strange tests or examining bedsheets. Medieval society was publicly modest in many ways, yet strangely intrusive when it came to marital sex. And here's a shocking fact many people don't realize. In some medieval wedding traditions, guests accompanied the couple all the way to the bedroom after the ceremony. Yes, seriously. Friends and relatives might stand around joking, singing, drinking, and helping prepare the marriage bed before finally leaving the newlyweds alone. In noble households, this could become almost ceremonial. The consummation of marriage wasn't seen as entirely private because it affected inheritance and legitimacy. People wanted proof the union had truly begun. Honestly, it sounds like an absolute nightmare for introverts. Religion shaped every aspect of marriage. The church taught that wives should obey husbands. Husbands should guide wives spiritually. And both should avoid sinful sexual behavior. Marriage was considered sacred, but paradoxically, many medieval religious thinkers viewed celibacy as spiritually superior. Some monks and theologians believed sexual desire itself was morally dangerous. So medieval married couples lived under constant moral scrutiny. Even within marriage, certain sexual acts were condemned. There were rules about holy days, fasting periods, and acceptable behavior in bed. Some medieval Christians were forbidden from having sex during major religious seasons, pregnancy, menstruation, or Sundays. Depending on how strictly people followed church teaching, there may have been surprisingly few approved days left in the calendar. Now, imagine being a medieval woman trapped in a terrible marriage. Maybe your husband was cruel. Maybe he drank constantly. Maybe He beat you? Maybe he disappeared for months. Could you divorce him? Almost certainly not. And this is where the title of tonight's story becomes painfully real. No divorce, at least not in the modern sense. The medieval church generally considered marriage permanent. Annulments existed, but they were difficult, expensive, and usually required, proving the marriage was invalid from the start. Maybe the couple was too closely related. Maybe consent wasn't properly given. Maybe consummation never happened. But ordinary, unhappily married people, they were mostly expected to endure, and medieval punishments for adultery could be horrifyingly unequal. Men often escaped with lighter consequences, while women faced severe public shame. In some places, accused women could be beaten, humiliated, or socially destroyed. Female sexuality was heavily controlled because inheritance depended on certainty about children's fathers. Noble families obsessed over legitimate heirs. A wife accused of infidelity threatened entire bloodlines and property systems. Meanwhile, men's affairs were often treated with more tolerance, especially among elites. The double standard was enormous. There's also something strangely sad hidden beneath all these rules. Despite everything, the pressure, the laws, the politics, people still fell in love. They wrote poetry. They exchanged gifts. They dreamed about romance. Medieval literature is full of impossible love stories, precisely because real marriage often lacked romance. Tales of forbidden love became wildly popular because reality could feel so restrictive. Courtly love poems imagined passion outside arranged marriage systems. Knights worshipped unattainable women. Secret affairs filled stories and songs. In some ways, medieval romance culture existed because actual marriage was often practical rather than emotional. And honestly, that tension feels weirdly familiar even today. Society changes, technology changes, but humans remain humans. People still struggle between personal desire and social expectation. Medieval marriage rules may seem bizarre to us now, but they reveal something timeless about power, survival, religion, and relationships. They remind us that marriage has never been just about two people. It has always reflected the fears and values of society itself. But what makes this story even darker is what happened after the wedding ceremony ended. Because for many medieval brides, the real nightmare began not at the altar, but inside the home itself. In the next chapter, we're going to explore daily married life in medieval Europe, including the shocking household rules wives were expected to follow, the punishments husbands could legally justify, and the deeply uncomfortable reality of sharing beds, rooms, and lives in a world with almost no privacy at all. So the wedding feast is finally over. The candles have burned low. The musicians are exhausted. The guests are drunk on ale and gossip. And somewhere outside, muddy village roads disappear into complete darkness. The priest has blessed the union. The families have exchanged their promises. Maybe there was dancing. Maybe there was nervous laughter. Maybe the bride smiled politely while secretly terrified about what her future would look like. And now, for the first time, the couple is alone together, or at least as alone as medieval people could possibly be, which, honestly, was not very alone at all, because one of the strangest things about medieval life is how little privacy existed. Modern people are used to bedrooms, locked doors, personal space, quiet bathrooms, and moments of solitude. Medieval families, not so much, especially among peasants. Entire households often slept together in a single room. Parents, children, grandparents, servants, and sometimes even animals shared the same living space. Imagine trying to build a romantic, married life while chickens wander nearby and relatives snore 3 feet away. The idea of a peaceful, candlelit private bedroom is mostly fantasy for ordinary medieval people. In reality, life smelled like smoke, sweat, damp, straw, and livestock. And yes, medieval beds themselves could be horrifying. Fleas, lice, mites, and bedbugs were constant companions. Mattresses were usually stuffed with straw, feathers, or rough fabric. And unless you were wealthy enough to replace bedding regularly, tiny insects thrived inside them. Some people slept almost sitting upright because lying completely flat was associated with death. Curtains around beds weren't just decorative either. They helped trap warmth because medieval buildings were freezing in winter. Stone castles may look romantic in movies, but many were damp, smoky, and unbelievably cold. Wealthy nobles often traveled with portable bedding because sleeping arrangements in castles could still be miserable. And here comes one of the first shocking facts of the night. In many medieval households, newly married couples did not automatically get their own bed. Beds were expensive luxury items. Ordinary families often shared sleeping spaces out of necessity. In inns, travelers commonly slept beside complete strangers. Some medieval workers even slept in shifts, using the same bed at different times. So when historians say medieval married life lacked privacy, they really mean it. Your arguments, your illnesses, your intimacy, everything happened near other people. Now, here's something deeply uncomfortable. Medieval husbands were often socially permitted to discipline wives physically. Yes, really? While excessive violence wasn't universally accepted, many societies tolerated a certain level of wife beating as part of household authority. Religious writers sometimes advised husbands to correct wives gently, which still assumed husbands had the right to punish them at all. Some legal traditions even discussed acceptable tools or limits for physical punishment. It's horrifying to modern ears, but medieval society largely believed maintaining order inside the household mattered more than protecting women from abuse. And yet, despite this harshness, medieval marriages were not always loveless prisons. Human relationships are complicated. Some couples genuinely cared deeply for one another. There are surviving letters filled with affection and longing. Husbands grieved wives who died in childbirth. Wives managed businesses while husbands traveled. Couples prayed together, worked together, survived disasters together. Medieval people laughed, flirted, argued, and loved, just like we do. That's what makes this history feel strangely emotional sometimes. Even inside restrictive systems, people still searched for comfort and companionship, but daily life could become extremely tense because marriage wasn't only emotional, it was economic survival. Every member of the household had to contribute labor. Laziness, illness, or incompetence threatened everyone's well-being. Food shortages happened regularly. Winters could become brutal. One failed harvest might push families toward starvation. Under those conditions, marriage became less about personal fulfillment and more about teamwork under pressure. Romance existed where it could fit between exhaustion and survival. Now, let's talk about medieval bathing habits, because this topic has become surrounded by myths online. Contrary to popular jokes, medieval people did not completely ignore hygiene. Many actually cared a great deal about cleanliness. Public bathhouses existed in towns. Wealthier people washed with scented water. People cleaned hands before meals and used herbs to mask odors. But maintaining hygiene consistently was difficult. Clean water wasn't always accessible. Soap was limited. Laundry required exhausting labor, and crowded living conditions spread smells rapidly. Add livestock, smoke-filled homes, open sewage, and limited ventilation, and medieval houses could become intensely unpleasant. One shocking detail historians mention is that some medieval people believed certain illnesses spread through bathing because warm water opened the pores to disease. During plague outbreaks especially, attitudes toward bathing became complicated. Imagine living in a world where medical knowledge was uncertain. Diseases appeared randomly, and nobody truly understood germs. Fear shaped behavior constantly. And speaking of fear. Nighttime inside medieval homes was genuinely terrifying. Once darkness fell, villages became eerily quiet except for distant animals, creaking wood, wind, and occasional voices. Without electric lighting, darkness felt absolute. People believed demons, witches, ghosts, and evil spirits moved more freely at night. Many families slept with religious objects nearby for protection. Strange noises in the dark carried real psychological weight. Medieval Europe was deeply superstitious, and the home itself became a place where spiritual dangers supposedly lurked. Now imagine being trapped in an unhappy marriage inside this environment. There was nowhere to escape privately. Divorce barely existed. Economic independence for women was limited. Communities watched each other constantly. If your husband frightened you, ignored you, controlled you, or hurt you, your options were painfully small. Some women entered convents to escape marriages or avoid them entirely, but convent life required specific circumstances and resources. Most women simply endured. And here's another shocking fact many viewers don't expect. Marital love was sometimes viewed suspiciously if it became too passionate. Certain medieval thinkers worried intense, romantic attachment distracted people from God. Obsession, lust, and emotional excess were considered spiritually dangerous. So while modern culture glorifies passionate romance, parts of medieval culture actively distrusted it. Stable obedience mattered more than emotional intensity. Food inside medieval households also reflected hierarchy. In wealthy homes, husbands often received the best portions. Nobles displayed status through extravagant feasts involving roasted meats, spices, and imported luxuries. Peasants survived largely on bread, porridge, vegetables, ale, and occasional meat. Malnutrition was common during difficult years. Imagine trying to maintain a happy marriage while constantly hungry. And perhaps the saddest part of all this is how quickly death could tear families apart anyway. Disease outbreaks, infections, accidents, childbirth complications, war, and famine meant medieval marriages often ended early through tragedy rather than divorce. Many people remarried multiple times simply because spouses died so frequently. Children lost parents constantly. Stepfamilies became common. Life was emotionally fragile. Still, medieval people kept marrying. They kept celebrating weddings, telling love stories, holding feasts, and dreaming about stable homes. Humans have always searched for connection, even in harsh conditions. And maybe that's why this history still feels strangely familiar beneath all the discomfort. Because even though the rules were different, the emotional hopes underneath them weren't entirely different from ours. But things become even darker when we leave ordinary peasant homes behind and step into the world of noble marriages, where power mattered more than affection, and young brides could become political tools in terrifying games between wealthy families. In the next chapter, we're going to enter medieval castles themselves, where queens, noble women, and aristocratic daughters faced shocking expectations, dangerous childbirths, arranged alliances, and marriages that could literally decide the fate of kingdoms. If peasant marriage was about survival, noble marriage was about power. Massive, dangerous, kingdom-shaping power. Tonight, as the wind howls softly around our imaginary stone castle and torchlight flickers against damp medieval walls, we're stepping into the lives of aristocratic women. Women dressed in silk and velvet, surrounded by servants and gold, yet often trapped more tightly than almost anyone else in society. Because for noble families, marriage was not simply personal, it was political strategy. A daughter's wedding could secure military alliances, and feuds unite territory, increase wealth, or protect dynasties. In some cases, an entire kingdom's future depended on whether one teenage girl successfully produced a healthy son. And honestly, that pressure started frighteningly early. Noble children grew up understanding that their futures were rarely their own. A lord's daughter might spend her entire childhood hearing whispers about future marriage arrangements. Families negotiated engagements like business deals. Wealthy fathers discussed dowries, inheritance rights, and political advantages long before the bride herself had much say in the matter. Some noble girls were promised in marriage before reaching adolescence. Imagine being 12 or 13 years old and already knowing your life path had essentially been decided during conversations between powerful adults. Now, medieval nobles absolutely believed marriage should strengthen family honor. Love was considered unpredictable. Passion could cloud judgment. A strategically useful marriage mattered more than emotional compatibility. And because inheritance was everything, noble women's bodies became deeply connected to political stability. Queens, duchesses, and aristocratic wives were expected to produce legitimate heirs quickly and repeatedly. Their fertility wasn't merely personal. It affected succession, land ownership, alliances, and national security. That sounds dramatic, but it's genuinely true. Entire wars erupted because royal marriages failed to produce sons. One of the most disturbing realities of noble marriage is how young some brides truly were. Medieval society viewed adulthood differently, but even by those standards, certain royal marriages feel deeply unsettling today. Teenage girls entered dangerous pregnancies before their bodies were fully mature, and pregnancy itself was terrifying. Noble women faced constant pressure to bear children despite childbirth being one of the leading causes of death for women across all social classes. Imagine knowing your family, your husband, your kingdom, and the church all expected you to become pregnant, while fully understanding that each birth might kill you. And here's a shocking fact many people don't realize. Medieval childbirth rooms often became intensely crowded. Noble births especially were public events in strange ways. Female attendants, servants, relatives, midwives, and witnesses filled the chamber because everyone wanted confirmation that the child truly belonged to the mother and hadn't been secretly swapped. Privacy during labor barely existed. Some royal births were practically political spectacles. In later centuries, crowds even witnessed queens giving birth to prevent rumors about illegitimate heirs. The pressure must have been unimaginable. And sadly, childbirth mortality haunted noble families constantly. Some queens spent most of their adult lives pregnant because producing heirs mattered so desperately. Repeated pregnancies weakened bodies over time. Infections spread easily. Doctors lacked proper medical knowledge. Even wealthy women with access to better food and attendance remained extremely vulnerable. Historians estimate many medieval women experienced multiple pregnancies with only some children surviving into adulthood. Infant mortality was devastatingly common. Parents tried not to become too emotionally attached too quickly because the children died so frequently. Now imagine the emotional loneliness of noble marriage. Noble women were often sent away from their childhood homes to unfamiliar castles among strangers. A young bride might suddenly find herself living hundreds of miles away, surrounded by people loyal to her husband rather than her. She was expected to adapt immediately, learning household management, court etiquette, political expectations, and religious duties, while also navigating pressure to produce heirs. Some husbands treated wives kindly, others treated them as useful property, and castles themselves. They were not always luxurious dream palaces. Medieval castles could be cold, smoky, noisy, damp, and deeply uncomfortable. Stone walls trapped moisture. Fires filled rooms with smoke. Toilets were primitive. Wealthy nobles owned beautiful clothing and jewelry, yes. But daily physical comfort remained surprisingly limited. Winter inside castles could feel brutal. Imagine wearing layers of heavy fabric, while drafts creep through cracks in stone walls, and candle smoke stings your eyes. One particularly eerie part of noble marriage involved the marriage bed ceremony. In some aristocratic traditions, guests escorted the newlyweds to bed after the wedding feast. Music, jokes, blessings, and public celebrations surrounded the moment before consummation. Sometimes servants helped undress the couple while relatives observed ceremonial rituals nearby. The purpose wasn't romance, it was legitimacy. Noble families wanted certainty. The marriage had physically begun. Honestly, modern audiences watching this unfold would probably want to disappear into another dimension from sheer awkwardness. And then there were the terrifying consequences if a noble woman failed politically. A queen, unable to produce sons, might lose influence rapidly. Rival factions at court could turn against her. Rumors spread constantly in medieval royal courts. Infertility, miscarriages, stillbirths, or daughters without sons could create enormous instability. Some kings blamed wives for failing to provide heirs. Even though modern science tells us the husband's genetics determine biological sex, medieval people didn't know that. Women carried the blame. In some extreme cases, queens faced exile, imprisonment, or public humiliation. Noble women existed in highly visible positions, where private failures became public crises. Every pregnancy became political news. Every miscarriage sparked gossip. Every interaction at court carried hidden danger. Medieval courts were full of spies, alliances, betrayals, and rumors disguised as polite conversation. Now, here's something fascinating. Despite living under restrictions, some noble women became incredibly powerful. Queens sometimes ruled as regents while sons were too young to govern. Aristocratic wives managed estates during husbands' absences. Noble women controlled finances, supervised servants, arranged marriages, negotiated alliances, and influenced politics behind the scenes. Medieval society officially promoted male authority. But reality could become much more complicated when intelligent, capable women navigated power structures carefully. Still, their authority remained fragile. A noble woman's reputation mattered enormously. Accusations of adultery could become catastrophic because inheritance depended on legitimate bloodlines, and medieval punishment for suspected female infidelity could be horrifying. Some women faced imprisonment, public humiliation, beatings, or execution, depending on time, period, and region. Meanwhile, noblemen often maintained mistresses openly with fewer consequences. The double standard was impossible to miss. One particularly shocking medieval belief involved the idea that women were morally weaker and more vulnerable to temptation. Religious authorities often portrayed Eve from the story of Adam and Eve as proof women could lead men into sin. This shaped attitudes toward wives for centuries. Noble women were expected to remain modest, obedient, sexually faithful, and spiritually disciplined at all times. Their behavior reflected directly upon family honor. And yet, medieval literature simultaneously idealized women in bizarrely romantic ways. Knights wrote poetry praising noble ladies with obsessive devotion. Courtly love stories imagined beautiful aristocratic women inspiring heroic acts. Troubadours sang emotional songs about unattainable ladies. So noble women existed inside a strange contradiction, publicly controlled and restricted, yet romantically worshipped in literature almost like mythical beings. But reality inside castles could become deeply frightening during political conflict. If a husband lost power, wives and children became vulnerable to noble women were sometimes captured during wars, used as bargaining tools, or forced into strategic remarriages after widowhood. A wealthy widow especially became politically valuable because her lands and inheritance could transfer through remarriage. Some widows were pressured into new marriages almost immediately. And speaking of widowhood, strangely enough, becoming a widow sometimes gave noble women more independence than marriage itself. Widows could manage estates, control finances, and avoid direct male authority more easily than married women. Some actively resisted remarrying because widowhood offered rare freedom. That detail says a lot about medieval marriage dynamics. Honestly, now let's talk about one of the darkest realities of noble life. Child brides entering adult relationships far too early While not every marriage involved immediate cohabitation, many young girls still faced terrifying emotional pressure. Medieval culture normalized adulthood earlier than today, but the psychological reality remains deeply uncomfortable. From a modern perspective, girls trained from childhood to become obedient. Wives often lacked power to resist much older husbands or family expectations. And then there's the emotional silence surrounding women's suffering. Medieval records were mostly written by men priests, nobles, officials, scholars, so historians often glimpse women's pain only indirectly. A queen dies in childbirth at 17. A noblewoman enters a convent after repeated pregnancies. A wife disappears from records after political disgrace. Sometimes entire lives survive only through brief legal documents. It feels haunting, honestly. Behind every medieval alliance was a real person navigating fear, pressure, loneliness, and expectation. Yet despite everything, noble courts still celebrated love stories obsessively. People longed for romance even inside systems built around power. Secret affairs flourished. Forbidden relationships inspired legends. Emotional desire kept colliding with political reality. Maybe that's why medieval romance stories became so dramatic, because actual marriage often left emotional needs painfully unmet, and things become even stranger once we step outside castles entirely into the medieval church's growing obsession with controlling not just marriages, but people's actual body desires and private behavior. Because in the next chapter, we're entering the deeply uncomfortable world of medieval sex laws, religious punishments, forbidden relationships, and the shocking bedroom rules that governed married couples across medieval Europe. By now, you might already be thinking medieval marriage sounds exhausting. And honestly, we haven't even reached the truly uncomfortable part yet. Because tonight, as candlelight flickers against monastery walls and distant church bells echo through cold medieval streets, we're stepping into one of the strangest realities of medieval life. The fact that the church believed it had authority not only over your soul, but over your bedroom too. Modern people are used to separating religion from intensely private personal behavior, at least to some degree. Medieval Europe, absolutely not. The church viewed marriage as sacred, sexual behavior as morally dangerous, and human desire itself as something requiring constant supervision. Priests preached about it. Religious courts investigated it. Theologians argued endlessly about it. Entire books were written explaining when married couples could have sex, why they should have sex, how often they should have sex, and perhaps most bizarrely, when they absolutely should not. And this is where medieval marriage starts feeling almost surreal to modern audiences. Because according to many medieval religious teachings, there were huge portions of the calendar during which sex was discouraged or forbidden. Lent, often forbidden. Advent, forbidden in many places. Sundays, frequently discouraged. Major feast days, sometimes forbidden. Certain fasting periods, also forbidden. Pregnancy, complicated. Menstruation, forbidden according to many beliefs. After childbirth, restricted for long periods. Some theologians calculated so many forbidden days that married couples theoretically had surprisingly few acceptable opportunities left. Imagine trying to keep track of all that without accidentally committing a sin. And yes, medieval people genuinely worried about this. Confession became deeply important because ordinary Christians feared punishment in the afterlife. Priests questioned people about intimate behavior in ways that would feel unbelievably invasive today. There were manuals written specifically to help priests investigate sexual sins during confession. Some asked detailed questions about positions, frequency, fantasies, adultery, contraception, and improper acts. Honestly, some medieval confession manuals read less like spiritual guidance and more like bizarrely judgmental relationship interrogations. One shocking fact historians often mention is that medieval Christians sometimes believed even married, sex could become sinful if motivated purely by pleasure instead of reproduction. Think about that for a second. A husband and wife, legally married, following church teachings, could still feel guilty for enjoying intimacy too much. Certain theologians worried pleasure distracted people from spiritual purity. Sexual desire itself was treated almost like a dangerous fire, constantly threatening moral collapse. And yet, paradoxically, the church also insisted married couples owed each other intimacy. This concept was known as the marital debt. Essentially, husbands and wives were expected to provide sex to one another upon request. Refusing repeatedly could actually become grounds for complaints in religious courts. Now, obviously, reality varied wildly, but the idea itself is fascinating and disturbing at the same time. Marriage created obligations over people's bodies in ways that feel deeply uncomfortable from a modern perspective. And here's where things become even stranger. Medieval courts genuinely handled cases involving incredibly intimate details. Couples argued publicly about infertility, adultery, virginity, and consummation. Witnesses testified, neighbors gossiped, priests investigated. There are surviving records of medieval courts discussing whether husbands were physically capable of intercourse or whether wives remained virgins after marriage. Some cases became humiliating spectacles. In one especially bizarre practice, some medieval courts relied on proof involving bedsheets stained with blood after the wedding night. The belief was that bleeding confirmed virginity, even though modern medicine tells us that's unreliable and often completely inaccurate. But medieval society obsessed over female chastity because inheritance and legitimacy mattered so much. Noble bloodlines depended on certainty about paternity, so women's sexuality became heavily controlled. And honestly, the fear surrounding adultery could become terrifying. Men worried about raising children who weren't biologically theirs. Families feared inheritance disputes. The church feared moral chaos. As a result, accusations of adultery carried enormous consequences, especially for women. Punishments ranged from public humiliation to violence, depending on the region and period. Some women accused of infidelity were forced to perform public acts of repentance, while neighbors watched. Meanwhile, powerful men often escaped harsher judgment. Kings and nobles kept mistresses openly at times. Some fathered illegitimate children without destroying their reputations. The double standard was massive and painfully obvious. Now, let's talk about forbidden relationships. Because medieval Europe had incredibly complicated rules about who you were allowed to marry. The church prohibited marriage between close relatives, which sounds reasonable at first. But medieval definitions of too closely related became astonishingly broad. At certain points, people were forbidden from marrying relatives as distant as seventh cousins. Seventh cousins. Imagine trying to calculate that in a tiny medieval village where everybody had known each other for generations. And it became even more confusing because spiritual relationships counted too. Godparents and godchildren could create family-like bonds, restricting marriage possibilities. So, medieval marriage law turned into this tangled web of bloodlines, alliances, and religious technicalities. Ironically, wealthy nobles sometimes exploited these rules strategically. If a powerful man wanted to escape a marriage, suddenly investigators might discover the couple was too closely related after all. Convenient timing? Right. And speaking of escaping marriage, annulments existed, but they were incredibly complicated. Unlike divorce, annulment claimed the marriage had never been valid from the beginning. Reasons might include lack of consent, non-consummation, hidden impotence, prior marriage contracts, or prohibited kinship. Wealthy people with political influence had better chances of securing an ordinary unhappy couples, much less likely So for many medieval wives, trapped in cruel or miserable marriages, there was essentially no realistic escape. And unfortunately, violence inside marriage often remained hidden or tolerated. Medieval society viewed the household as a hierarchy headed by the husband. Some religious authorities condemned extreme cruelty. Yes, but many still assumed husbands had the right to discipline wives physically. Women facing abuse had very limited protections. Communities sometimes intervened if violence became scandalously public, but private suffering often stayed private. Now, here's something eerie to imagine. Medieval people genuinely believed supernatural forces influenced sexuality and marriage. Demons supposedly tempted humans into lust. Witches were accused of causing impotence through magic. Certain charms or curses were blamed for infertility. In a world without scientific understanding of psychology or medicine, fear filled the gaps. If a marriage failed sexually, some couples literally suspected witchcraft. There are records of men claiming magical spells prevented consummation on their wedding nights. Priests performed blessings or exorcisms trying to fix the problem. Honestly, medieval Europe sometimes feels like this strange mixture of deep religious devotion, fear, superstition, and desperation, all tangled together. And then there's the deeply uncomfortable medieval obsession with controlling women's bodies specifically. Female desire was often portrayed as dangerous or morally weak. Religious writers constantly warned men about seductive women, leading them into sin. Eve's role in the biblical fall became symbolic justification for mistrusting female sexuality for centuries. Women were expected to remain modest, obedient, and sexually restrained at all times. Yet at the same time, medieval culture was obsessed with romance stories. That contradiction is fascinating. On one hand, priests warned about lust, destroying souls. On the other hand, songs and poems celebrated passionate love constantly. Knights supposedly fought tournaments, inspired by devotion to beautiful ladies. Secret affairs filled literature. Forbidden romance became wildly entertaining, precisely because society restricted desire so heavily. Humans always seem drawn to it, whatever they're told they shouldn't want. And perhaps the strangest thing of all is that medieval people themselves probably found many of these rules exhausting too. Not everyone followed church teachings perfectly. People had affairs. People broke rules. People ignored restrictions. Priests themselves sometimes violated vows of celibacy despite official teachings. Medieval society constantly struggled between ideal morality and messy human behavior. Still, the church's influence remained enormous because religion shaped daily existence from birth to death. Marriage wasn't merely emotional or legal. It was spiritual. People genuinely feared eternal consequences for sinful behavior. Hell felt real. Demons felt real. Divine judgment felt immediate and terrifying. So imagine being a medieval married couple trying to navigate all this pressure. Survival, religion, sexual expectations, fear of sin, family obligations, constant pregnancy risks, public gossip, and almost no privacy whatsoever. Honestly, it's amazing anyone stayed sane. But despite all these rules, people still found ways to rebel. Secret lovers met in hidden corners of castles. Couples eloped against family wishes. Women resisted unwanted marriages. Men abandoned households. Human desire kept slipping through the cracks of medieval control systems. And in the next chapter, we're going to explore some of the most shocking rebellion stories of all, including forbidden love affairs, runaway brides, scandalous queens, secret romances, and the terrifying punishments medieval society unleashed when people dared to love the wrong person. For a society obsessed with rules, medieval Europe produced an astonishing number of scandals. And honestly, maybe that shouldn't surprise us. The stricter the system became, the more desperately people searched for cracks inside it. Tonight, as moonlight spills across castle courtyards and distant horses echo through narrow stone streets. We're stepping into the dangerous world of forbidden love, secret affairs, runaway couples, scandalous queens, hidden relationships, and desperate people risking everything for emotions. Medieval society tried very hard to control, because despite all the sermons about obedience and morality, medieval people were still human. They still fell in love with the wrong person. They still became trapped in unhappy marriages. They still longed for excitement, tenderness, passion, escape, and emotional connection. And sometimes those feelings exploded into chaos. Now, medieval society officially treated adultery as a serious moral and social threat, not just because religion condemned it, but because inheritance depended on legitimate bloodlines. Noble families needed certainty about heirs, property, titles, and political alliances. All rested on the assumption that children truly belonged to their fathers. So when a woman had an affair, or was even suspected of having one, the consequences could become catastrophic, and unfortunately, women almost always faced harsher punishment. A nobleman caught with a mistress might receive criticism or gossip. A noblewoman accused of infidelity could face imprisonment, exile, public humiliation, or worse. Her reputation could collapse instantly. In some regions, accusations alone were enough to destroy lives. Even without proof, medieval courts often relied heavily on rumors, witness statements, and reputation. Imagine living in a world where your neighbor's gossip might determine your future. And here's something particularly terrifying. Women accused of adultery were sometimes subjected to humiliating public punishments designed to shame them socially forever. In certain places, adulteress performed public penance wearing special clothing or walking through towns while people mocked them openly. Medieval justice loved spectacle. Punishment wasn't just about discipline, it was about public warning. But of course, the more forbidden love became, the more fascinating people found it. That's part of why medieval literature is overflowing with secret romances. Stories about forbidden lovers became wildly popular because they reflected emotional tensions people understood deeply. Tales like Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, or countless tragic romances explored themes medieval audiences secretly obsessed over: passion versus duty, love versus marriage, desire versus religion. And honestly, some of these stories became shockingly scandalous for their time. Take Queen Guinevere from Arthurian legend. Her affair with Lancelot wasn't merely romantic drama. It threatened the entire kingdom itself. Medieval audiences understood exactly how dangerous adultery could become politically. One affair could shatter alliances, trigger wars, destroy dynasties, and undermine social order. That's why these stories felt emotionally explosive. Now, let's step away from fiction for a moment, because real medieval courts produced scandals just as dramatic. Royal courts were full of temptation. Nobles lived surrounded by attractive attendants, musicians, servants, knights, ladies-in-waiting, and political rivals. Marriages arranged for power often lacked emotional intimacy, and courts created environments where rumors spread constantly. People watched each other obsessively. One glance, one dance, one private conversation could spark scandal. And here's a shocking fact many people don't realize. Medieval castles often had surprisingly little privacy despite their enormous size. Servants moved everywhere. Rooms connected unpredictably. Walls were thin. Household members observed one another constantly, so hiding an affair required incredible caution, which probably made forbidden relationships feel even more thrilling. Some medieval queens became infamous for rumored affairs, whether true or not, and honestly, accusations themselves were often political weapons. If enemies wanted to weaken a queen, accusing her of adultery could damage legitimacy instantly, since royal bloodlines mattered so much. Rumors about a queen's sexuality threatened entire dynasties. One horrifying example comes from cases where queens or noblewomen were accused of producing illegitimate heirs. Even suspicion could lead to imprisonment or execution. Medieval politics was ruthless. Women's bodies became battlefields for power struggles between ambitious men, and yet, despite the danger, secret affairs absolutely happened. Letters survive from lovers separated by marriage obligations. Poems describe hidden meetings and impossible longing. Some couples exchanged coded messages through trusted servants. Others met during hunts, festivals, or religious pilgrimages. Imagine the tension of trying to maintain a secret relationship in a world where communities monitored behavior constantly. Now, here's something fascinating. Medieval people often distinguished between marriage and romantic love almost as separate concepts. Marriage handled property, alliances, and family duty. Romance existed in songs, fantasies, affairs, and literature. Courtly love traditions especially encouraged emotional devotion outside marriage itself. Knights worshipped married noblewomen from afar, writing poetry and performing dramatic acts of loyalty to modern audiences. This feels bizarrely contradictory. Why glorify romantic passion while structuring marriage around practicality? But medieval society genuinely struggled with this contradiction. Passion was viewed as emotionally powerful, but socially dangerous. Stable marriages maintained order. Romantic obsession threatened chaos. And honestly, they weren't entirely wrong about the chaos part, because some forbidden relationships ended disastrously. Elopements, for example, could trigger family feuds or violence. A runaway bride embarrassed her entire family publicly. Wealthy daughters represented political and financial assets. If a woman married without permission, inheritance disputes erupted immediately. Angry relatives sometimes hunted couples down. In extreme cases, families imprisoned daughters to prevent unwanted marriages. Imagine being in love while knowing your family might literally lock you away for it. And unfortunately, forced marriages absolutely happened too. While church law technically required consent, reality became murky when powerful families applied pressure. Young women, especially, had limited ability to resist arrangements chosen for them. Some entered convents specifically to avoid unwanted marriages. Others fled. A few secretly married lovers against family wishes, gambling everything on emotional connection over security. One especially shocking medieval reality involved accusations of love magic. People genuinely believed potions, charms, and spells could create irresistible attraction. If someone became obsessively infatuated, neighbors sometimes blamed witchcraft rather than emotion. Women accused of seduction might be suspected of using magical herbs or curses. Medieval Europe constantly blurred the line between romance and fear. And then there were prostitutes. Another deeply uncomfortable contradiction inside medieval society, officially condemned by religion. Prostitution still existed openly in many towns because authorities believed men's sexual desires needed outlets. Some cities even regulated brothels. Certain religious thinkers argued prostitution prevented greater sins, which reveals a lot about medieval attitudes toward sexuality and gender. But prostitutes themselves lived vulnerable, dangerous lives. Many were poor women with few alternatives. Violence, disease, social stigma, and exploitation surrounded the profession constantly. Medieval morality judged them harshly while simultaneously tolerating their existence. Now let's talk about jealousy, because medieval jealousy could become terrifyingly violent. Husbands obsessed over female fidelity, partly because inheritance depended on legitimate heirs. A wife's affair threatened not only emotions, but property, bloodlines, and social status. In some regions, violent retaliation against adulterous wives received shocking levels of tolerance. And sadly, women had little protection against false accusations either. Reputation mattered enormously. Once rumors spread, proving innocence became difficult. Communities remembered scandals for years. Yet despite all this fear, people still chased romance. That's the part I find strangely moving. Even in cold castles, exhorting villages, restrictive religious systems, and dangerous political environments, people still risked everything for emotional connection. They wrote desperate love poems. They met secretly at night. They dreamed about impossible futures together. Humans never stop wanting love, even when society makes love dangerous. And perhaps the sad truth of all is that some medieval people probably experienced more emotional intimacy in secret affairs than in their actual marriages. Arranged unions secured stability, but hidden relationships sometimes offered affection, passion, and understanding people couldn't find elsewhere. Of course, medieval authorities hated that idea, because if individuals started prioritizing personal happiness over family duty, political alliances, or religious rules, the entire system became unstable, which is exactly why punishment for forbidden love could become horrifyingly severe. And in the next chapter, we're going to enter the darkest side of medieval marriage culture yet, including public punishments, humiliating marriage laws, abusive traditions, executions tied to adultery accusations, and the terrifying ways medieval society enforced obedience through fear. The deeper we travel into medieval marriage, the darker it becomes. Because tonight, under storm clouds gathering above narrow medieval streets, we're stepping into a world where love was controlled, not only through religion and family pressure, but through fear, public fear, violent fear, humiliating fear. Medieval society believed social order had to be protected at all costs, and marriage sat at the center of that order. A disobedient wife, an adulterous husband, a runaway bride, a scandalous affair. None of these were treated as merely private problems. They were seen as threats to the entire moral structure of society itself. And honestly, medieval punishments could feel terrifyingly theatrical, because punishment during the Middle Ages wasn't always designed simply to hurt people physically. It was designed to humiliate them publicly. Communities watched. Neighbors whispered. Shame became a weapon. Medieval authorities understood something timeless about human psychology. Many people fear public humiliation almost as much as physical pain. One particularly uncomfortable medieval tradition involved public penance for sexual sins. People accused of adultery or improper behavior could be forced to stand before the community wearing humiliating clothing while confessing wrongdoing publicly. In some towns, offenders walked barefoot through streets while neighbors mocked them openly. Others carried candles during church services as symbols of repentance. And yes, sometimes these punishments involved married couples themselves. Imagine your worst relationship moment becoming a public spectacle for your entire town. Now, to be fair, medieval punishments varied enormously across different regions and centuries. Europe was not one single uniform culture, but the larger pattern remained clear. Marriage laws were enforced through social pressure and public shame constantly, and unfortunately, women almost always carried heavier risks. A husband suspected of adultery might receive criticism. A wife accused of infidelity could lose her reputation permanently. Female honor became tied directly to sexual behavior in ways that feel suffocating today. Since inheritance depended on certainty about paternity, society obsessed over controlling women's bodies and reputations. One shocking fact from medieval legal history is how often communities monitored women's behavior collectively. Neighbors paid attention to who visited whose house, who walked together at night, who seemed too friendly, who became pregnant unexpectedly, or who argued publicly with husbands. Medieval villages had almost zero anonymity. Privacy barely existed, and sometimes accusations spiraled into total disaster. A rumor could destroy a woman's future even without evidence. If enough people believed someone behaved improperly, social isolation followed quickly. Marriage prospects vanished. family honor suffered. In some cases, accusations triggered formal investigations by church courts or local authorities. Now let's talk about one of the most disturbing medieval ideas, the belief that wives should remain obedient to husbands almost no matter what. Religious teachings frequently compared husbands to rulers of tiny kingdoms inside the home. Wives were expected to submit patiently, quietly, and respectfully. Women, described as disobedient, loud, or rebellious, became targets of intense criticism. Medieval literature mocked outspoken wives constantly, and this led to some horrifying punishments. In later medieval and early modern Europe, certain women, accused of gossiping, arguing excessively, or publicly challenging husbands, faced humiliating devices like the scold's bridle, a metal cage placed around the head with a piece forcing down the tongue. Historians debate how widespread these punishments truly were, but even the existence of such devices reveals deep cultural fear surrounding outspoken women. Honestly, it feels chilling, and unfortunately, domestic violence often remained normalized within limits. Medieval society, generally, believed husbands had authority to discipline wives physically, if necessary. Excessive brutality might draw criticism, but ordinary violence frequently stayed hidden behind household walls. Women had very few legal protections compared to modern standards. Imagine being trapped in a marriage with no realistic escape route, no divorce, no financial independence, no private support systems, and a society telling you obedience was morally virtuous. That emotional reality must have felt crushing for many women. Now, here's something especially eerie. Medieval punishments often blended religion with fear of social disorder. Authorities believed sinful behavior angered God and endangered entire communities. Plagues, famines, floods, or military defeats could be interpreted as divine punishment for collective immorality. So, when people violated marriage expectations, neighbors sometimes viewed it as spiritually dangerous for everyone. That's partly why public punishment became so important. Authorities wanted visible demonstrations of moral control. And then there were accusations tied to witchcraft. This is where medieval fear becomes almost surreal. Women who behaved strangely, resisted authority, remained unmarried too long, practiced herbal medicine, or became involved in sexual scandals sometimes, attracted suspicion of supernatural wrongdoing. Not every accusation led to witch trials, of course, but medieval Europe increasingly associated female independence with danger. One shocking belief involved the idea that witches could cause impotence or destroy marriages through magic. Men unable to consummate marriages occasionally blamed curses. Jealousy, infertility, or failed relationships could all become tangled with superstition. Imagine living in a society where your unhappy marriage might literally be blamed on demons. And sadly, fear often made people cruel. Communities under stress looked for scapegoats constantly. During difficult times, famine, plague, war, social tensions intensified. Women already viewed as troublesome or immoral became vulnerable targets. Now, let's talk about runaways, because despite all the risks, some people still tried escaping marriage. Husbands abandoned wives. Wives fled abusive households. Secret lovers disappeared together. But survival afterward could become incredibly difficult, especially for women. Without family support or financial resources, running away meant enormous danger. Some women sought refuge in convents. Others attempted to vanish into larger towns where anonymity became slightly easier. But medieval Europe remained tightly interconnected socially. Finding